The grand summit hall stretched before her like a cathedral built to worship power she would never possess. From her position near the entrance, Omega Lyra watched the sea of wolves flow past in their finest silks and furs, their scents marking them as clearly as banners. Alpha, Beta, Alpha, Beta, Alpha, never Omega. She supposed that was fitting. No one particularly wanted her here either. The summit was held once every decade at Silver Peak Keep, neutral ground chosen precisely because it belonged to no single pack. A month of negotiations, alliances, territorial disputes. The kind of politics that shaped the continent while wolves like her served drinks and kept their heads down. Except this time, her father had sent her to represent the Thornmoor pack. Not because he valued her opinion, because the summit was important enough that Thornmoor needed representation, but not important enough to justify an alpha's time. Send the Omega daughter. Let her practice at politics. She can't do much damage. Your place is at table 47, the attendant said, not quite meeting her eyes. The pity was almost worse than the disdain. Table 47 proved to be located in what could generously be described as the geographical center of social irrelevance. The great hall was arranged in concentric circles, radiating out from the high table where the Council of Alphas sat. The closer your table to the center, the more you mattered. 47 was practically in a different room. Lyra sat down at the empty table and watched 5 other place settings remain conspicuously vacant, while wolves found their assigned seats and promptly began networking with anyone but her. A server delivered the first course, venison in blackberry reduction, and looked momentarily surprised when Lyra thanked her. The banquet proceeded in waves. Courses arrived and were cleared while around her. Conversations bloomed like flowers she wasn't invited to smell. To her left, she could see the Silver Claw contingent holding court, their table crowded with visitors paying respects. To her right, the Nightshade Pack entertained a parade of smaller territories hoping to curry favor. And at table 47, Omega Lyra of Thornmoor sat alone, watching her venison grow cold. She had just decided that leaving early might be less humiliating than staying when a voice said, "This seat taken?" Lyra looked up and found herself meeting the amber eyes of an alpha male who looked like he'd been in meetings for approximately forever. His formal jacket was slightly rumpled, his dark hair disarranged, and he was smiling at her with tired warmth. No, she managed. Please. He dropped into the chair beside her with a genuine sigh of relief. Thank you. I've been mediating a border dispute for the last 4 hours, and both parties now hate me equally, which is apparently the sign of successful negotiation. He extended his hand. Cale Ashford? I probably should have introduced myself before sitting, but honestly, I needed to sit somewhere before I fell over. She took his hand, feeling the warmth and strength there. Lyra, of the Thornmoor pack. Lyra. He said her name like it mattered. Excellent. Now I know who to thank for rescuing me from another hour of forced small talk with wolves who want favors I can't grant. Despite herself, she felt her mouth twitch toward a smile. I didn't rescue you. You rescued yourself. Semantics. He noticed her untouched plate and flagged down a passing server. Could we get fresh courses here? This venison's gone cold, and I missed the first 2 rounds entirely, while explaining why calling someone's proposal adequate can start a blood feud. The server, perhaps startled by being addressed directly by an alpha who actually cared, nodded quickly and hurried off. Kyle turned his attention back to Lyra with focus that suggested he was genuinely interested in what she might say next. So, tell me about Thornmoor. I'm embarrassed to admit my briefing on the Northern Territories was basically exists, stable leadership, nice forests. And just like that, for the first time since arriving at the summit, Lyra felt something shift. Someone was looking at her, actually looking at her, as though she mattered. The morning session on territorial boundary disputes had been designed as some sort of endurance test for consciousness itself. Lyra sat in the tiered assembly hall, watching a holographic map cycle through what had to be the 900th variance of borderline adjustments and wondered if this was how progress actually happened. Slowly, painfully, one tedious compromise at a time. Beside her, Kale was taking notes with the determined focus of someone fighting off sleep. They'd gravitated toward each other naturally when the sessions began, Kale appearing with 2 cups of coffee, and the greeting, "I come bearing caffeine, and the hope that today involves fewer discussions about whether pine trees constitute natural boundaries." "Any success on that front?" she'd asked. "We've agreed that pine trees are, in fact, trees. I'm calling it a win." Now, 3 hours into the session, that coffee was a distant memory. The Ironclaw representative was explaining in excruciating detail why current hunting ground allocations discriminated against packs with larger populations. Kale's stylus had stopped moving. She glanced over and saw he'd written, "If I start snoring, please claim it's an alpha meditation technique." She pressed her hand to her mouth to suppress a laugh, and then an idea struck her, sharp and clear. She leaned toward Kale and whispered, "Thornmoor has shared hunting grounds with 3 neighboring packs for 50 years. We developed rotation protocols that account for population differences." Kale's head turned, eyebrows raised. "Meaning?" "Meaning we've already solved this. Variable access schedules, seasonal adjustments, shared. Maintenance responsibilities. We couldn't afford conflict because we needed every territory we could use." Something shifted in Kale's expression, a sharpening of attention that reminded her he wasn't just friendly, but an actual diplomat who understood when something useful had been said. "You should mention that." "I should what?" "During open commentary. That's the whole point of these sessions." Lyra felt her stomach tighten. Speaking up meant drawing attention. Attention meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant everyone would see exactly how little her pack mattered. But Kale was looking at her with expectation, as though he genuinely believed she had something worth contributing. The Ironclaw representative concluded with what sounded like either a summary or a threat. The moderator announced the open commentary period in a tone that suggested it rarely expected anyone to use it. Kale nudged her foot under the table. Lyra pressed the activation button on her seat before she could reconsider. A soft chime indicated her request to speak. "The chair recognizes Lyra of Thornmoor," the moderator announced. Every head in the chamber turned toward her. Her mouth went dry. Then she caught Kyle's eye, and he made a small, encouraging gesture. "Thank you, moderator." Her voice came out steady. "Thornmoor has operated shared hunting grounds with neighboring packs for 5 decades. We found that rotation protocols and seasonal adjustments effectively address the population disparity issues under discussion. Rather than fixed allocations, we use a contribution-based system where larger packs provide support services, territory maintenance, prey monitoring, emergency assistance, that benefit the entire network." She stopped, acutely aware that she'd just spoken longer than most of these wolves had probably ever heard her name mentioned. The silence felt enormous. Then the Silver Claw representative said, "This precedent merits examination. Does Thornmoor maintain documentation?" "Yes," Lyra said, relief flooding through her. "I can provide details to any interested parties." "Please forward to the committee," the moderator said. The session moved on, but something had shifted. When they broke for midday meal, 4 different delegates approached her to request information about Thornmoor's protocols. Kale walked with her toward the gardens, where the keep's landscapers had coaxed plants from across the continent to coexist in careful harmony. "See?" Kyle said, settling onto a bench. "You had something worth saying. You made me say it." "I made you nothing. I just reminded you that you were allowed to." He pulled out a ration pack and examined it with deep suspicion. "Your pack really does shared territories? That's not diplomatic padding?" "We do. Started out of necessity. The major packs weren't interested in our region because the yields weren't high enough for their operation costs. So we developed our own techniques." Kale had given up on the ration pack. "Half the wolves in that chamber represent packs that are essentially vassals to larger powers. The fact that you've maintained independence is actually impressive." Warmth spread through Lyra's chest at the casual compliment. My father would say it's stubbornness rather than strategy. Sometimes those are the same thing. Around them, the garden hummed with quiet conversations. A group of betas were examining a rose variety with genuine interest. This afternoon is bilateral meetings, Kale said, consulting his schedule. I have to explain to the Silverclaw Pack why our territorial markers don't constitute acts of aggression. He paused. What's on your agenda? Lyra pulled up her own schedule. Nothing. I'm assigned to general attendance, which means I sit in observation areas and watch other people conduct actual business. That's ridiculous. You just demonstrated expertise they're actively debating. I'm from Thornmoor, Kyle. We don't get bilateral meetings. Kale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You know what the problem is with people like me? We spend so much time studying pack customs that we forget the most important one. How you treat someone says more about you than about them. He stood up. The Silverclaw meeting isn't until 1400 hours. Before that, I'm supposed to have an informal consultation with smaller pack representatives about territory language standardization. You should come. Kale, I wasn't invited. You are now. I'm inviting you as an expert consultant on independent pack protocols. He grinned. What? You just proved you're qualified. Before Lyra could argue, her datapad chimed. She glanced down and saw formal requests for materials, 3 different packs asking for detailed information about Thornmoor's protocols. Kyle, she said slowly, I think people are actually interested. Of course they are. You gave them something useful. He checked his watch. We've got 45 minutes, enough time for you to grab actual food and for me to send some messages. Think you can handle a few hours of people actually wanting your opinion? Lyra looked up at him, this alpha who'd wandered into her isolation and somehow decided she deserved better. I think I can manage. Good, because honestly, I have no idea what half these terms actually mean in practice, and I was really hoping you'd help. As they walked back toward the keep's central halls, Lyra caught their reflection in a polished window. An Alpha and an Omega walking side by side like they had every right to be exactly where they were. For the first time since arriving at the summit, she thought maybe they did. The observation tower at 2 a.m. was Lyra's favorite discovery. The circular room wrapped around one of the keep's spires, its windows offering an unobstructed view of the forest and mountains beyond. At this hour, it was blessedly empty. She'd come here 3 nights running now, unable to sleep through the strange combination of exhilaration and anxiety that had become her constant companion. The days had transformed into something unrecognizable. Meetings, consultations, actual conversations with wolves who knew her name and sought her input. The Ironclaw Pack had requested a partnership discussion. A coalition of 7 minor packs wanted her advice on forming a cooperative network. It was overwhelming, wonderful, terrifying. The door opened behind her. Kale entered carrying 2 cups. I had a 50-50 shot you'd be here, he said, crossing to where she stood. You're developing predictable patterns. Shouldn't you be sleeping? Don't you have that Silverclaw session in 6 hours? Yes, and I've accepted it'll be a disaster regardless. He handed her a cup. Thornmoor blend. The kitchens have your preferences on file now. She accepted the cup, surprised by how close the approximation was. You didn't have to bring me tea at 2 a.m. I was already making some for myself. He settled into a chair. Want to talk about it, or should we just stare at the forest in companionable silence? She sipped the tea, organizing thoughts that had been circling for days. I received an invitation this evening. Alpha Darius of Silverclaw wants to meet tomorrow. Private consultation about regional stability initiatives. Kale's expression shifted, something sharp flickering across his features. Darius himself. That's significant. That's what worries me. 3 weeks ago, I couldn't have gotten Darius to acknowledge my existence. Now he wants a private consultation. Why? Because you've made yourself relevant. You've demonstrated expertise, built connections, proven you're more than your pack's modest reputation suggested. I'm thrilled. I'm also not naive. Silverclaw doesn't meet with minor pack Omegas out of newfound respect. They meet when they want something, or when we've become inconvenient. Maybe both. Kale drank his tea. What's your instinct? That I'm about to be offered something that sounds generous but isn't. Good instinct. What are you going to do? Lyra laughed shortly. That's the question keeping me awake. Say no and risk offending one of the most powerful packs in the region. Say yes and risk becoming whatever they want me to become. Sure there is. You go to the meeting. You listen. Then you make a decision based on what serves Thornmoor's actual interests. Kale leaned forward. Lyra, when you first sat at that table, how many delegates knew your name? Possibly none. And now? She considered. More than I expected. Wrong answer. Now you've got major packs requesting meetings, minor packs seeking advice, and proposals incorporating your suggestions. You've changed the calculation. Is this where you warn me to be careful? This is where I remind you that being careful doesn't mean being small. He stood and walked to the window. If Darius is reaching out, it's because he sees 10 moves ahead. That's not a threat unless you let it be. A transport was arriving at the keep's lower gates, its lights painting brief orange across the tower. The coalition of minor packs, Lyra said slowly. They're meeting tomorrow morning. I was going to attend, and now I'm thinking I shouldn't, because Darius might see it as choosing sides. Here's a radical idea. What if you attend because it's genuinely useful for Thornmoor's interests, and then meet with Darius afterward, and trust that you're capable of navigating both? But what if those goals end up incompatible? Then you deal with that when it happens. He turned to face her. You know what I think scares you more than Darius's attention? That you've realized you're good at this. That you actually might build something meaningful. And that means you can't hide behind the excuse that your pack's irrelevance makes you irrelevant. You matter now, and that's harder, because now you have something to lose. The tower's heating system cycled, and Lyra registered it as the keep taking a breath. I hate that you're right, she said finally. I'm rarely right about important things. I'm just loud about my guesses. He picked up his empty cup. You should sleep. Tomorrow will be complicated regardless. At the door, he paused. For what it's worth, I think you should attend the coalition meeting. Not because it's safe, but because it's right. And then meet with Darius, and show him exactly who he decided to approach. Someone who makes her own decisions. By the time Lyra finally returned to her quarters, she'd made her decision. She would attend the coalition meeting. Then she would meet Alpha Darius, and he would discover that the Omega he'd decided to notice had no intention of being anyone's convenient piece. She slept for 4 hours and woke feeling like she'd been granted a weapon, the certainty that whatever happened next she would face it as herself. The emergency session had been called at midnight, which meant everyone was operating on insufficient sleep and maximum anxiety. Lyra sat in Assembly Chamber 1, watching the holographic display cycle through territorial maps of the disputed borderlands that edged her own pack's territory. 4 major packs claimed rights. Silverclaw cited historical treaties. Ironclaw pointed to current territorial markers. A coalition of corporate interests insisted commercial investment gave them authority. A regional defense alliance argued strategic necessity. None would yield without losing face, and patrol wolves from 3 factions were currently positioned uncomfortably close to each other in the disputed zone. Kale, seated 2 rows behind her, had sent a message. Remember when we thought boundary disputes were boring? I'd like to formally apologize to boundary disputes. 4 hours into circular arguments, even Kale's humor couldn't penetrate the weight of what was happening. This was the sharp edge where diplomacy failed, and wolves started dying. The moderator called for a recess, and Lyra stood on numb legs. The chamber emptied in clusters, major packs gravitating together, minor packs lingering uncertainly. She was heading for the exit when Alpha Darius materialized at her elbow. Lyra of Thornmoor. A word, if you have a moment. She'd been expecting this. The disputed lands bordered Thornmoor's territory, making her pack technically adjacent without being directly involved. Perfect position for someone looking to use her as a proxy. Of course, Alpha. He guided her to a private alcove. Once the privacy barrier activated, Darius's demeanor shifted from diplomatic courtesy to calculation. Silverclaw is prepared to offer Thornmoor favorable hunting rights in our eastern territories, he said without preamble. Reduced patrol fees, priority access, protection guarantees. Generous terms for a pack your size. In exchange for? Your support for our territorial claim. A statement from Thornmoor regarding historical precedent would carry weight precisely because you're not a major power. Neutral observer, supporting our position. It was exactly what she'd predicted. An offer that sounded generous but came with strings that would turn her into exactly what she'd feared. A month ago, she would have been tempted. A week ago, flattered. Now she recognized it for what it was, an attempt to purchase her relevance and redirect it. That's a substantial offer, she said carefully. May I ask what Silverclaw's response would be if Thornmoor proposed an alternative solution? Darius's eyes flickered. An alternative? The borderlands edge my territory. I've spent 4 hours listening to arguments about historical claims and commercial investment, and no one has mentioned the obvious approach. She pulled up her datapad and displayed the maps she'd been studying. A cooperative. All parties maintain presence. Contributions and returns distributed proportionally. Thornmoor administers operations as neutral arbiter, using our existing protocols for multi-party territory sharing. You're suggesting Silverclaw share control with Ironclaw and corporate interests? I'm suggesting everyone gets what they need, access to resources and security against escalation, without anyone admitting they lost the political argument. It's the same framework we use in our region, and Thornmoor would be honored to serve as administrator, naturally for a small administrative fee. Silence stretched. Then Darius said, You've thought this through. I've had 4 hours and detailed knowledge of similar situations. It's not perfect, but it prevents the imperfect solution where wolves start dying. Silverclaw would need to review. Of course, I plan to present when session resumes. I wanted to inform you first out of courtesy, since you were kind enough to offer Thornmoor your support. She smiled, slightly. Though I hope Silverclaw would find this worthy of consideration regardless. Darius studied her for a long moment. Finally, you are not what I expected. I get that a lot lately. When she emerged, Cale was leaning against the wall with studied casualness. So, how'd it go with our esteemed Alpha? I either just made a brilliant move or committed career suicide, possibly both. Those are basically the same thing at this level. He fell into step beside her. Want to tell me about it? She explained in quick sentences. When she finished, he was grinning. That's either going to work beautifully or explode spectacularly. Comforting. It wasn't meant to be comforting. It was meant to be accurate. They'd reached the observation deck where delegates had gathered during recess. Conversations fell silent when Lyra entered. The coalition of smaller packs she'd been advising was gathered near the windows. When they saw her, the Thornwood representative detached from the group and approached. Lyra of Thornmoor. If you're planning intervention, the coalition would formally support your position. She glanced at Kyle, who raised his eyebrows. I appreciate that, she said. I'll be proposing a cooperative approach that would benefit from multi-pack administrative support. If the coalition is interested in participating, I think we could build something substantial. More delegates drifted over, drawn by the sense that something was coalescing. Within minutes, Lyra found herself at the center of an impromptu negotiation, delegates firing questions about resource distribution, administrative oversight, security guarantees. She answered them, drawing on years of watching her father manage their operations, on the protocols she'd spent a week explaining, on confidence that had been building since an alpha sat beside her like she mattered. When the moderator called them back at 600 hours, Lyra had commitments from 7 packs and tentative interest from 2 major claimants. She requested time to address the chamber. This time, when she stood, she didn't feel anxiety. She knew exactly what she was doing. She presented the cooperative framework in clear terms. How it would function, who would benefit, why it prevented conflict while preserving core interests. She showed data from Thornmore's operations, proving the model worked. She addressed objections before they were raised. When Alpha Darius rose to speak, she braced for dismissal. Instead, Silverclaw finds merit in this proposal and would engage in good faith negotiations regarding implementation. Ironclaw followed. Then the corporate coalition. Within an hour, what had been an intractable crisis was becoming a framework for cooperation, and Lyra was being discussed as its architect. They broke for final consultations. Kale intercepted her with coffee and undisguised delight. "So, how does it feel to possibly have just prevented a war? Terrifying, exhausting, completely surreal. You gave everyone permission to back down without losing face, which is basically diplomatic sorcery." He clicked his cup against hers. "Also, you just made Thornmore relevant in a way that'll last beyond this summit. Minor packs are going to realize they don't have to accept invisibility. I'm not sure that's entirely positive." It's not. It's also not irrelevant anymore, which was the alternative. The vote came an hour later. Not unanimous, but decisive. The framework passed with sufficient support. Thornmore was formally designated as administrative coordinator. Lyra received messages from 30 delegations. Her father sent a terse communication. "Well done." From him that constituted effusive praise. On the last night of the summit, she stood in the observation tower, watching transport vehicles prepare for departure. She wasn't the same wolf who'd arrived 3 weeks ago, uncertain and invisible. She'd found her voice, built alliances, proven that size didn't determine significance. She was returning home to a pack that would face new challenges, and she was ready. Kale appeared beside her one last time, carrying 2 cups of terrible keep coffee. "So, Omega of Thornmore, administrator of a multi-pack cooperative, wolf who accidentally became relevant. How does it feel?" "Like I should be terrified, but I'm mostly excited. Probably not normal, but I've never been normal." He handed her a cup. "You're going to do extraordinary things, Lyra. This was just the beginning. What about you?" "Back to explaining protocol and preventing accidental territory wars. Someone has to do it. Besides, I've discovered I'm good at noticing wolves everyone else overlooks." He raised his cup. "To remembering you were never unwanted, just unnoticed, and to making damn sure nobody overlooks you again." She touched her cup to his, feeling the warmth of coffee and friendship and the strange, wonderful certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. "To new beginnings, and to alphas who sit beside omegas like they're queens. You are a queen, Lyra. You always were. I just had the good sense to grab the seat next to you before anyone else figured it out." Her transport's departure was announced. Time to go home. Time to begin the next chapter. She turned from the window, shoulders straight and head high, carrying herself with the authority she'd finally claimed as her own. Behind her, the mountains stood eternal, bearing witness to one more story of someone who'd learned they mattered. Because one person had taken the time to show them they always had.